Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. Now, Moscow is hosting crucial talks with Iran and 6 world powers over the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. Iran's chief negotiator, Saeed Jalili, is expected to clarify his country's position, which is that Iran has an inalienable right to have nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. There is also the threat coming from Israel and Washington of a military strike, with some saying that that would become more likely if there was an impasse in the Moscow talks. Sanctions have already been imposed on Iran, and these could get tougher. So is an agreement imminent on Iran's nuclear program? What about Moscow's role in the talks, and how does Moscow and Washington's approach towards Iran's nuclear program differ? Joining me to discuss this in the studio is Shirin Shafaie. She's from the campaign group against sanctions and military intervention in Iran, and from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Also in the studio is Matthew Harris. He's a Middle East blogger. On the line is David Hartwell. He's a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst from IHS Janes. And on the line from Moscow is Dmitry Kosyrev. He's a political analyst from the RIA Novosti News Agency. I'll start with a simple question to you, Matthew Harris. Do you think that these talks in Moscow this week, are they a last chance?
I hope they're not a last chance, because if we'd reached the point at which we were in last chance territory, things would be very grave indeed. I think the world is entitled to care about which types of regimes have nuclear weapons. And I think given the past behaviour of Iran's current regime, it's reasonable for the world community to want to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons.
Shirin Shafaie.
Well, it depends. Last chance for what? I mean, Iran is absolutely not pursuing any military nuclear capability, and this has been proved by all IAEA reports, more than 30 of them already, and none of them provides any shred of evidence that there is any diversion of nuclear material to military purposes in Iran. So your question that is it the last chance? Well, actually, the Western powers are buying time with these talks to keep the oil prices down. So for them, this is absolutely not the last chance, because if the talks collapse, that would mean an increase in the oil prices, which would be detrimental for President Obama's election campaign. But for Iran, I think they see things very differently, because these talks are not bearing any fruit for them. So maybe for them, this is the last talk that is going to take place.
On the line from Moscow is Dmitry Kosyrev. He's from RIA Novosti News Agency. He's a political analyst. The talks are taking place in Moscow. What's the view in Moscow there? Is there some kind of optimism that Russia can be a conduit for some kind of deal?
I'm not sure about optimism. There are many reasons that we expect only very modest, slight progress in these talks. But it doesn't look like failure. The main thing here is not to fail completely. And failing is not what Iranians want, and not what Russia or anybody else wants right now.
David Hartwell from IHS Janes. The bar is set relatively low, isn't it? There just has to be not complete failure. There has to be some kind of agreement, but there won't be any kind of pronouncement, will there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where we're heading. I think your correspondent in Moscow has really hit the nail on the head. I think that all sides will want to, at the very least, try to perpetuate the talks, and probably the best that can be hoped out of the Moscow round of talks is that they agree to meet again. The danger is that the talks will become an end in themselves rather than a means to actually resolving the crisis.
Matthew Harris, a Middle East blogger. There's 3 key concessions on the table, I suppose, that Washington and their allies are demanding. By those, I mean the shipping out of its existing stock of highly enriched uranium, the shutting of the nuclear Fordo site, and also the stopping of enriching uranium to 20%. I mean, how likely are these concessions going to be agreed to by Iran?
That is the pivotal question, because if those remain the international community's key demands and Iran remains immovable on them, then I guess you're not going to see any progress. I would hope that there are elements, even within the current fairly despicable Iranian regime, that could be open to compromise on these issues. I would also hope that were we to reach a point at which Iran were to have free elections and they were to elect what I would consider to be a more rational government, maybe they would be more open to concessions on these issues. But I think the really interesting point that underlies your questions is that the world community is making some very simple demands to Iran that are coupled with some very simple and in some ways quite generous offers of things that the world community will do in return for Iranian concessions. So,
Shirin Shafaie from SOAS, you're saying that Iran's program is completely peaceful and that there really isn't any need for this kind of vehement criticism of Iran. It wouldn't really countenance making any kind of concessions, and certainly not the concessions that Washington is demanding.
Well, Iran is a member, actually, of one of the first founding members of the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. Iran has a right under that treaty, NPT, to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. And the first Security Council resolution in 2006, which demanded suspension from Iran, actually ignores that right to Iran. And these offers, which are on the table, so-called offers, none of them respect Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. And it's actually very ironic that this 5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council, are actually permanent members of the Security Council because they have nuclear bombs here. So it's, the level of hypocrisy here is just bizarre. Even during the Iran-Iraq war, when Iraq attacked Iran with chemical weapons, Iran didn't retaliate. So history shows us that Iran is not going down that path.
Is Iran not meddling in Syria? Did Iranian-backed Hezbollah agents not blow up civilian targets in Argentina?
Well, not
Has
anymore.
Iran not threatened to wipe a UN member state off the map?
No, Iran has not threatened to wipe any country off the map. That's just a myth. Iran said that the Israeli...
He never said it? You're telling me President
I-
Ahmadinejad didn't say it and an Iranian general didn't recently repeat it?
No,
in
he
the last
said
few
that the
weeks?
Zionist regime will evaporate from the page of time like the apartheid regime in South Africa did and like the actually fascist regime in Germany did.
This is the same president who hosted a conference to celebrate cartoons that have jokes about the Holocaust, who has repeatedly said that he wants to destroy the state of Israel.
No, Iran is holding a conference next year for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East region, and that's very important. And Russia actually agrees with Iran on that and is very vocal about having a nuclear weapons WMD-free region, which is only not happening because the sole entity in this region who has actually nuclear arsenal, more than 200 warheads, is Israel.
Considering they're surrounded by countries that constantly threaten their destruction, can you blame them for wanting a nuclear deterrent?
Well, who is actually refusing to agree to multiple UN Security Council resolutions? The Israelis are still keen on their settlements. They're still suppressing the Palestinians' right to existence and to have an independent state.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing Iran's nuclear programs. In the studio is Shirin Shafaie. She's from the campaign group against sanctions and military intervention in Iran. Also in the studio is Matthew Harris. He's a Middle East blogger. On the line is David Hartwell. He's a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst from IHS Janes. And on the line from Moscow is Dmitry Kosyrev. He's a political analyst from the RIA Novosti News Agency. Okay, well, look, I'll turn to David Hartwell from IHS Janes. I mean, there is, I suppose, a degree of, from Tehran's point of view, a degree of hypocrisy that they're being lectured to about nuclear programs from countries that have nuclear weapons.
Possibly. I think there are questions, though, that Iran has not specifically provided answers to. And clearly, the idea that the IAEA has given Iran a clean bill of health in the last 5, 6, 7 years is not completely accurate, because the IAEA has flagged a number of concerns about the nature and purpose behind the Iranian nuclear program, and the Iranians have consistently refused the IAEA access to the Partian military complex. So where there are clearly issues there, but it's very easy to be relativistic in terms of well, it's the nuclear club dictating to the non-nuclear club. But if Iran's nuclear program is purely for civilian purposes, then why has it consistently failed to provide adequate reasons for its enrichment program, which is arguably well beyond the needs for a civilian program?
Well, Shirin Shafaie, I'll throw it back to you. There is no. It seems like the line has shifted, that there is an acceptance that Iran will have lower enriched uranium, but the desire to have 20% enriched uranium, which is not far away from making weapons grade material, is the sticking point, and that's really what Iran can't justify, can it?
No, it can justify, because Iran already has offered not to enrich up to 20% in return for nuclear fuel, but nobody actually in the nuclear club offered to provide Iran with that. So Iran had to go ahead, and that's not for energy purposes. That's actually for medical purposes. Because
hold on a second. Wasn't the deal last year in January, the offer for the French and the Russians would provide Iran with the nuclear material that it was looking for its medical reactor in Tehran in exchange for exporting and ceasing production to 20%. That was well on the table, and that was offered to Iran, and Iran rejected it.
No, Iran actually had an agreement with Turkey and Brazil in 2010.
No, that was the second agreement. There was an original agreement which the Iranians rejected, and then the Turks provided another agreement, which is the one the Iranians rejected, but it was made outside of the IAEA, and it didn't have the IAEA safeguards built into it, which is why the Iranians accepted it.
Yes, I have to agree with you on that, because I think Iran made a mistake not to agree to the Russian proposal. Actually, it was originally Russian in 2009. And Russians were very upset with it. According to one Russian expert, it was the last straw on to break the camel's back, Iran's refusal to agree with the Russian proposal in 2009. But then again, Iranians went ahead and had another agreement with, I'm sure they had their own reasons not to agree to that proposal, because it demanded Iran to ship out all its stockpile of low-enriched uranium to another country and not to for return for any guarantees. Iran wanted some guarantees. And in the Turkey-Brazil deal, it's not true that IAEA was not involved. The low-enriched uranium was supposed to go to Turkey under the IAEA custody. And actually, President Obama, in his letter to Turkish and Brazilian leaders in April of 2010, said that if Iran does this is going to build confidence. And President Obama's letter is published now.
Well, talking about Russia's role in these talks, I'll turn to you, Dmitry Kosyrev, from the RIA Novosti News Agency in Moscow. What are some of the historic reasons why Russia's relationship with Iran differs from that of Washington's relationship with Iran?
Well, as we see from here, we are devoid of this, shall we say, Iranian method. And we do not even understand this demonization of Iranian actions. Russia is not exactly afraid of Iranian nuclear program. After all, the French have nuclear bomb too, and we are not quite worried about that. So this is not the question, but we don't want a huge conflict on our southern borders and to the southern brink of Caspian Sea, which is also ours. And we're trying to inject some reason in the whole situation. But we are certainly not very optimistic about the speed with which this solution can be achieved. Because try to imagine that today in Moscow we declare that the compromise has been reached and the agreement is here. And next day, President Obama's rivals, Mitt Romney especially, would declare that the president has compromised to Iranians this and that. That's impossible. So what we want to do is gently, slowly to let the negotiations drag on until the year end at least. Then we shall see all the outlines of the agreement. And then maybe next year we shall see something like settlement between Iran and the world community, especially considering the changing situation in the Middle East in general.
Matthew Harris, do you agree with that? Do you think that there could be a solution as early as next year? That sounds very fanciful and optimistic, doesn't it?
It sounds very optimistic, but having said that, in terms of the slightly complex history that was being talked about to do with who offered what to whom and those offers that were under IAEA auspices and those that weren't, one has to hope that this can be a rational problem which has a rational solution. But the problem I have with that is that, with the best will in the world, I do not see the current Iranian regime as being a rational actor.
David Hartwell from Janes, is Iran potentially an irrational actor in all this? I mean, they have made some kind of noises that at some degree of compromise, haven't they? And they're being hit by punitive sanctions. There's got to be a point when Tehran thinks, well, this isn't a price worth paying, surely. It
depends what you mean by rational and where you're sort of posing to what extent you're posing the rational question. Because in some extent, I think in the past. And I think to some extent today there is too much of a temptation to label the Iranians as completely irrational. I don't necessarily believe that. I think if you're looking at for instance if you're sat in Tehran and you're an Iranian leader and you are surrounded by Pakistan on one border, Israel potentially on another border, then from an Iranian point of view it makes rational sense to develop a nuclear weapon. Russia on the northern border, China as well, not far away. So from their point of view, there is reasoning behind that. Of course, that's where that rationale butts up with the international rationale of preventing international weapons proliferation. So that is essentially the crux of the conflict. And so, but I don't believe necessarily that. I think that there is a rationality within the Tehran regime that they know how far they can push this. And now, whether they think that extends to a nuclear breakout in terms of a weapon, or whether they build their nuclear capabilities to a point where they have all the infrastructure in place in order to then perform, then to sort of effectively hold, the sort of Japanese type scenario, then that remains to be seen. But I do firmly believe that Tehran knows how far it can push this in terms of the risk that it can take before inviting an Israeli or an American attack.
Shirin Shafaie from SOAS, there has to be. And key, I guess, to these talks is how much Washington can impress upon Tehran that there would be a military attack. And Iran is playing that game, isn't it? It's, well, you haven't made a strong enough threat just yet, so we'll keep on hanging out. That's what it's doing, isn't it?
I think it's exact other way around, because President Obama is buying time until his re-election in November to keep the oil prices down with this continuance of talks, whereas Republicans, on the other hand, want to intensify their threats to keep the oil prices high, and Israelis as well.
All right. Well, look, actually, just specifically about the Russian side of things. Earlier, I interviewed the Russian Lieutenant General Yevgeny Burzhinsky. He was a former department deputy head in the Russian Defense Ministry. I asked him earlier whether Russia would want, in return for its role in these brokering talks with Tehran, some kind of assurance from Washington about not putting up a missile defense shield in Eastern Europe, and how this plays into the talks. Because obviously a non-nuclear weapon-capable Iran would mean that this missile defense shield would be unnecessary.
These two issues, in my opinion, are interconnected. Because, first of all, as a military man, and I was dealing with Iranian missile and nuclear problem for very many years, we still do not believe that Iran is very close neither to a nuclear bomb nor to a long-range missile. It's much more talk than reality. But of course, nuclear Iran is not the best, the best solution for Russia, since it's our neighbor. But these issues, relations between Russia and the United States, will be discussed. If Iranian missile and nuclear problem disappears, then, the reasoning for United States building up anti-missile defense in Europe, of course, it becomes questionable.
Dmitry Kosyrev from RIA Novosti in Moscow. So this is going to play out in the talks today, isn't it? Russia wants a little bit from Washington in return for what it can do to help the Iranian nuclear situation.
Well, for now, it's rather Washington that wants some kind of understanding from the Russian side. And the recent meeting between our president and President Obama confirmed this approach. They want us to be mediators and to soften the blows around Syrian problem and Iranian too, and they are connected. In fact, we are not really concerned with our military relations and security relations with the United States, but we are concerned more now about the Middle East in general. You see, the problem is that if things go on like they do now, and jihadization of Middle Eastern nations goes on, then Iran and Syria will be the only and the most, at least decent regimes in the whole area, while the rest will slide into Muslim Brotherhood's craziness. That's what we see in Libya and probably in Egypt and even in Tunisia. So the whole situation will change. And next year, Washington may really want to ask us about our opinion, what to do in a new Middle East, and what to do with Iran in this case. They would probably really need a friendship with understanding with Iran to contain the leftovers of this Middle Eastern jihadization, which nobody knows when it stops.
Shirin Shafaie from SOAS. I mean, what do you make of the Russia's position here? Why does Tehran why are they prepared to do business with Moscow?
Bilateral relations between Moscow and Tehran, and Moscow and Washington, and are very interesting. As you mentioned, Russia and United States had this kind of thing going on in Seoul when President Obama asked Medvedev to ask Putin to give him space so that he can deal with the missile defense when he gets back to power in November. But in fact, I think Russians would make a mistake if they trust a vague promise of an American president with slightly uncertain future over their relation with Iran. And also, President Obama doesn't have a very good reputation of keeping promises, both in terms of his relations with Middle Eastern former allies and in terms of all the promises that he made to his own people. So I don't think that that's a very good idea that the Russians are pursuing to give him space over Iran in the hopes that he will solve their missile defense problem in November.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing Iran's nuclear programs. In the studio is Shirin Shafaie. She's from the campaign group against sanctions and military intervention in Iran. Also in the studio is Matthew Harris. He's a Middle East blogger. On the line is David Hartwell. He's a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst from IHS Janes. And on the line from Moscow is Dmitry Kosyrev. He's a political analyst from the RIA Novosti News Agency. David Hartwell from Janes. This could hammer Obama and come the next election if there's no real kind of resolution here.
Yes, I think clearly Obama is worried about perhaps appearing weak on his foreign policy aspects to the vote in November. I do think on the Iranian issue there is a fairly level consensus within the American political and military establishment that military action against Iran is not advisable.
Matthew Harris, you blog about the Middle East, and I guess Washington, before any kind of military strike is countenanced, it has to give the green light to Israel, and it's not going to do that, is it?
That's a really, really interesting question, because technically the Israelis could do it without American approval. Having said that, the relationship that since the 1970s the State of Israel and the United States have had, the very close alliance they've had, means that it would be politically, one would argue, very difficult for an Israeli Prime Minister to do something like that without the explicit or implicit support of the Americans. And I think it's interesting in terms of the US presidential election that, yes, there are going to be voters, particularly Republican voters, who are saying, let's go and drop bombs on people. But there are also going to be an awful lot of other voters who find the idea of a war with Iran terrifying and will be voting for Obama in the hope that sanctions succeed and that a catastrophic conflict can be averted.
I think it is worth saying. Can I just add to that? I think there are question marks over whether Israel can effectively take the type of action you're talking about, and certainly not. I think that's why the Israeli strategy is effectively to put pressure on the Americans to get the Americans to take any action for them.
You mean in logistical terms, they need some sort of right? Okay.
In practical and technical terms, I think there are huge question marks over whether Israel can inflict the level of damage it would need to set back the program.
And that's Shirin Shafaie, isn't that part of Tehran's game? They've got to overplay the significance. They've got to suggest that there would be conflagration. It would be carnage in that region of the world should there be a military strike. And in actual fact, maybe Washington's banking that it might not necessarily be the case.
Iran doesn't really count Israeli attacks into its calculations because it knows that Israel cannot do that. Iran already has a weapon, and it's not a nuclear weapon. It's its control over the Strait of Hormuz, when the world economy depend on that for its energy supply. And in the case of
let's not forget the Iranian economy also depends on the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, it does. But if, there is a nuclear attack against Iran, such as those surgical attacks, or all the options are on the table, according to the American president, which includes a nuclear attack. That means mutually, assured destruction for Iran if Iran were to have a nuclear bomb. But its closure of the Strait of Hormuz could be equally successful and effective. So Iran doesn't need to have a nuclear weapon, because if it had a nuclear weapon, it would be more like North Korea, more isolated and really, detested by the rest of the international community. But its control over the Strait of Hormuz is already good enough.
I'd just like to briefly go into the wider region. Matthew Harris, you blog about the Middle East, as I said earlier. What about Syria? Iran would probably obviously want to avoid any kind of confrontation if Bashar al-Assad is weakened or overthrown. Syrian support seems to be pretty important for any kind of response to an Israeli strike. I mean, what do you make about that?
One of the fascinating things in Syria is that, yes, the Iranians are supporting Assad, and we're being told there are Iranian military-type people on the ground in Syria supporting Assad. But surely some of the Islamist groups that are opposing Assad, that are among the opposition to Assad, is it beyond the stretch of imagination that some of those also have had some Iranian intelligence backing at some point? So I'm really wondering what's going to happen in Syria and where Syria is going to go, whether we're going to end up with a permanent state of civil war with the Assad regime hanging on in government but not actually in control of the country.
Shirin Shafaie, is Syria something that's in the back of Tehran's minds when they go to these negotiations? 5+1
has asked Iran not to bring these so-called irrelevant issues to the negotiations, which I think it's not a good decision. Although Russia has been very vocal, the foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, has specifically said that Iran should be included in any solution for Syria, and it would be totally ineffective if Iran was not a part of that. I'll just finish actually now by a statement or a comment made by Ayatollah Khamenei, who is really, I guess, the final say on these programs. He made the point that a nuclear bomb is wrong. He said that we consider developing nuclear weapons as unlawful and, quote, a sin. Now, should we believe him?
To a certain extent, I would be prepared to believe him. I think the regime that he heads is oppressive and very unpleasant, but in religious terms I can respect a certain element of his sincerity, even though a lot of the things he's responsible for are fairly abhorrent. So there could be an element of truth in this, and this isn't the first time that a senior Muslim leader has come out with a fatwa of this nature, and it has the potential to be very exciting.
David Hartwell from Jane's, what do you make of the Ayatollah's statement?
As Matthew has just said, from a religious perspective, I think it's quite encouraging. I think ultimately, though, that that's representing the religious side of the Iranian regime, but there is another side which is extremely pragmatic and rational, and to some extent also there's another facet of it, of course, which is extremely ideological.
And just finally, I'll turn to you, Shirin Shafaie.
Let me just give you a brief history of that statement. It actually was declared by the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Imam Khomeini, during the Iran-Iraq War. And then in 2005, actually, Ayatollah Khamenei first issued this fatwa in a conference. And then again, he emphasized this fatwa in another disarmament conference last year. So, and also another point to add to that, it's in the back of Iran's commitment under NPT. This fatwa is legally binding for Iranians who are Shias. So it's not just ideological, it's legally binding.
I'd like to end now by thanking all of my guests for joining me on The Voice of Russia in London. That's Shirin Shafaie from the Campaign Group Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, and from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Matthew Harris, a Middle East blogger. David Hartwell, a senior Middle East and North African analyst from IHS Jane's. And Dmitry Kosyrev, political analyst from the RIA Novosti News Agency in Moscow.